ask many of you philosophers in the audience to show me mercy. I am a theologian by training, and I certainly very much appreciate the work of the EPS. In fact, when I was in college, I was interested in apologetics and went to an apologetics conference where I first learned about the work of the EPS. So very blessed to get involved with the work that's happening here. If I were to emphasize any particular word in the title of the paper, it would be the indefinite article A Molinist solution to the problem of the unevangelized. For those of you that are just walking in, if you text EPS to the number 22454, you'll get a copy of my paper. You'll be sent a link so you can follow along there. The problem of the unevangelized has seen a number of proposed solutions over the decades. From the classic exclusivism, which requires knowledge of Christ, inclusivism, which holds some might be saved in spite of no knowledge of Christ, for example, because of one's response to general revelation, post-mortem opportunities, most recently defended in Protestant circles by Jerry Walls and James Bilby, or outright pluralism and universalism. Rarely is Molinism offered as a framework for providing justification of God's justice for the fate of those who have never heard the gospel. In this paper, I argue that God's counterfactual knowledge of creaturely freedom distinctly separates itself from competing solutions to the fate of the unevangelized, specifically for the fate of infants, both pre- and neonatal, who die prematurely. Now, the term prematurely is here perhaps to be taken rhetorically. Their deaths might be premature in relation to our perspective, but if Molinism were true, not on God's perspective. This proposal will be a more faithful and uniquely Molinist solution to the fate of those unevangelized persons. And as a theodicy, not a defense, but a theodicy, should be integrated by confessing Molinists. First, I issue a suggestive correction to the advent of the theological reflection on God's knowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, logically prior to the divine decree. Then I argue that this ancient solution accommodates some competing Molinist frameworks, trans-world damnation, and the affirmation of contingently lost persons. Finally, I show how Molinism distinctly serves many approaches to the fate of infants who die prematurely. Now, some of you may be unfamiliar with Molinism and you're just interested in the fate of the unevangelized. So, for a quick description, Molinism is the proposal that God has a logical middle stage of his knowledge between his natural knowledge of all logically possible worlds and his free knowledge of the actual world. Between these two logical moments exists a middle stage, middle knowledge, which is God's foreknowledge of a range of feasible worlds which contain counterfactual truths. Ergo, God knows what Smith would have done had he been in circumstance C. In more simple terms, relative to each of these logical moments, God knows what could, would, and will happen. This view of divine foreknowledge has seen a resurrection in philosophical and theological conversations, due in large part to the work of Alvin Plantinga, Thomas Flint, and William Lane Craig. More recently, Kirk McGregor has published the first contemporary biography of Luis de Molina and a theological primer of Molina's framework. Many published articles have been typed in the exploration of the implications and ramifications that Molinism offers. As it pertains to the fate of the unevangelized, there is a growing number of published works seeking to incorporate how God's middle knowledge plays into the fate of those who have never heard the gospel. You can see the extensive footnote there. And take note of the note there at the end. There's a good chance that I missed some engagement between some critic and Craig. For those unfamiliar with such literature, if Molinism were true, then a new problem presents itself. What of those who respond poorly to general revelation and whom God knows would have accepted the gospel in some close possible world or a feasible world had they heard it? Are those persons simply the result of bad luck, a historical or geographical accident, or worse? Did God know that these persons would be damned in this world and not in some other possible world, and yet still created those persons particularly for eternal damnation when he could have done differently? This is what Craig calls the soteriological problem of evil, for its similarity in structure to the logical problem of evil. As I have surveyed some, I'm just a theologian, some or perhaps most of the Molinist literature on this particular issue, I found that there had been very little attention given to the concern over infants who die, either in the womb or shortly thereafter. John Sanders's No Other Name, an investigation into the destiny of the unevangelized, includes a mere 6 pages of engagement with Molinism, but worse, the appendix on the fate of infants is absent any material on how Molinism could contribute to this quandary. Much of the existing discussion pertains to persons of adult age, having already made choices about whether their will should follow or fail the standards of general revelation. But what of the fate of infants who die prematurely? This is a niche theological issue, but every year in the United States, hundreds of thousands of persons are aborted. And we may estimate that more than 60 million people have died in our country alone from this medical procedure. So what happens to those persons? And how can Molinism offer a solution for those unevangelized persons? To answer this, we will not begin by looking in an expected place. We will begin looking in an unexpected place. Pre- and neonatal theological reflection for prenatal Molinism. William Lane Craig considers Molinism to be one of the most fruitful theological ideas ever conceived. As a historical question, we should ask, when was it conceived? Most of us think that it was Luis de Molina, the 16th century Jesuit priest and philosopher. MacGregor claims that Molina's groundbreaking conception of middle knowledge constitutes a major turning point and arguably the decisive moment in the extensive history of theological and philosophical reflection. My doctoral work on original sin in certain 5th century monks, those so-called semi-Pelagians, led me to reading ancient letters and treatises which are unsurprisingly overlooked not only by the vast majority of Christian philosophers, but even by my fellow theologians. All of us are familiar with Aurelius Augustinus of Hippo, but few of us have heard of one of his Gallic followers, Prosper of Aquitaine. Prosper was a layman concerned about the surviving remnant of Pelagianism. He, inaccurately, believed that it was found in the teachings of John Cassian, claiming that there existed the remnants of the Pelagian depravity. Some translations have heresy there. Now, this is consistent with Prosper's own belief that one was either a Pelagian or an Augustinian. So if he couldn't pin Cassian as an Augustinian, well, he must have been a Pelagian. We might be familiar with such false dichotomies as Calvinism or Arminianism, especially for the Molinists out there. Prosper wrote 2 letters to Augustine. In one of them, he described the beliefs of these remnants of Pelagianism. They believe that human beings are judged based upon the wills of human beings who, with free choice, either do or neglect to do what they are commanded. Someone, either Prosper or someone else, the letter's not clear on this, objects that there are the countless number of infants who have as yet no wills, no actions of their own. What are we to think of these persons? Now, according to Prosper, the Gallic monks proposed that such infants are lost or saved in accord with how the divine knowledge foresees that they would be in their later years if they attained the age at which they could act. This position perplexes Prosper, who believes that this counterfactual truth claim means there are pretended merits because they imagine future merits which will not exist, and by their new kind of absurdity, actions that will not be done are foreknown, and those actions which are foreknown are not done. Here we may have the earliest Christian form of the grounding objection. The grounding objection is the concern of non-Molinists that the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom contain no truth value, and therefore God could not know them. This ancient interaction between Augustine, Prosper, and the Gallic monks, he describes, you may find fascinating, as I have. But what constitutes as Molinism is not just divine foreknowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, but God's foreknowledge being logically prior to the divine decree. Prosper does not communicate an explicit reference to this, but he does say that the monks subject God's election to pretended merits. This seems like it would imply divine election logically prior to the divine decree. Furthermore, regarding meticulous divine providence, Prosper wrote, "They say that the Lord foresaw that these people would believe and that each nation received at the proper time the services of teachers, when there was going to arise the faith of those with good wills." We see in these particular Gallic monks a model of divine foreknowledge which explains how certain circumstances have perfect timing for God's kingdom purposes. Is this meaningfully different than how the 21st century bearded Dutch philosopher Rick Peels describes it? God knows in advance whether S will bring the gospel to T, and therefore arranges things in accordance with S's bringing or not bringing the gospel to T. A teacher arrives, like the wizard Gandalf, precisely when he means to, or at least when God means him to, or rather, when they both mean to, which is prior to the moment when people of goodwill would exercise faith. So, was it John Cassian who conceived the notion of God's counterfactual knowledge of creaturely freedom prior to the divine decree? Cassian is, in my estimation, one of the most underrated theologians from the ancient West, but he should not be credited with such a conception. We are able to trace this concept further into Cassian's tradition of Eastern Greek theology to the writings of Gregory of Nyssa, one of the Cappadocian fathers from the 4th century. Later in his life, Gregory wrote a treatise called On Infants' Early Deaths. The question of the fate of infants arose because the church had been baptizing infants as a liturgical practice, and at some point came to embrace the theological belief that that was a salvific act, and cum hoc ergo propter hoc, that it was salvific because of the stain of original sin. John Sanders writes, "The early church fathers were largely silent concerning the destiny of unbaptized children. They did lean toward an endorsement of the concept of baptismal regeneration. However, this led to the grave fears of children who died without the sacrament." That is, what happens to those infants who are unbaptized? Gregory asks the same question that concerns us. If the recompense of blessedness is assigned according to the principles of justice, in what class shall he be placed who has died in infancy, without having laid in their life any foundation, good or bad, whereby any return according to his deserts may be given him? His solution was to propose that God judges the infant upon what they would have done had they lived. It is a sign of perfection of God's providence that he not only heals maladies that have come into existence, but also provides that some should be never mixed up at all in the things which he has forbidden. It is reasonable, that is, to expect that he who knows the future equally with the past should check the advance of an infant to complete maturity, in order that the evil may not be developed which his foreknowledge has detected in his future life, and in order that a lifetime granted to one whose evil dispositions will be lifelong may not become the actual material for his vice. Now, there is no precise language here of counterfactuals, but the concept is certainly there. That is, God looks into a future that does not take place in this actual world. Furthermore, Gregory's language indicates that God's knowledge of the counterfactuals informs his providential sovereign choices. In at least some cases, evil is prevented because God chose to create the world in such a way that those infants did not live to commit wicked actions. Elsewhere, he confirms this interpretation. This is that achievement of a perfect providence which I spoke of, namely, not only to heal evils that have been committed, but also to forestall them before they have been committed. And this, we suspect, is the cause of the death of newborn infants. As a matter of historical investigation, this should have the attention of contemporary Molinists. Here we are, in the 4th century, more than a millennium before Luis de Molina saw the light of day, and we have a church father, indeed, a small tradition of writings about God's counterfactual knowledge of creaturely freedom and divine providence. Of course, Gregory does not specify the logical moment at which God has this knowledge, so it would certainly be, at a minimum, anachronistic to call it middle knowledge. Nonetheless, his proposal sounds awfully similar to middle knowledge, especially because providence is informed by divine foreknowledge of counterfactuals. This model I call Gregorian Molinism, and it should be a benefit for Molinists seeking to address the fate of unbaptized or unevangelized infants. Let us consider two such cases: Gregorian Molinism on transworld damnation or the contingently lost. There presently exists an intra-Molinist debate on whether there are some persons who, having rejected the light of general revelation and never hearing the gospel, are lost, yet would have been saved had they heard and accepted the gift of salvation. Craig, the framer of this debate, holds it is possible that in order to create the number of persons in our world who will be saved, God had to create the number of persons who will be lost. It is possible that the terrible price of filling heaven is the filling of hell as well, and that in any other possible world, the balance between saved and lost would have been worse or the same. But note, not better. In The Only Wise God, Craig posits possible truths in order to demonstrate defeaters against the objections lodged by religious pluralists, that there's a contradiction for particularists in affirming both the justice and goodness of God and also the inaccessibility of the gospel. Yet, in no other name, Craig finds that this is quite plausible not only as a defense, but also as a soteriological theodicy. This principle Craig calls transworld damnation. Transworld damnation is the property of any person who freely does not respond to God's grace and so is lost in every world feasible for God in which that person exists. Put another way, all those who do not hear the gospel in this world and fail to live according to the standard of general revelation would not have accepted it had they heard it in any feasible world. This principle has caused much debate, so you might go back and see that footnote, but very little, if any, consideration has been given toward how transworld damnation applies, if at all, to the fate of infants who die prematurely. What if these persons had lived longer in other feasible worlds, and God middle knows what they would have done had they lived? It is logically possible that these persons all died in infancy, in the only feasible worlds available within God's parameters, for creating an optimal number of saved and lost. But if they had not, then here is how the transworld damnation defender could utilize Gregorian Molinism. On a strict reading of Craig's description, infants would not qualify for the property of being transworldly damned. Infants, depending upon their cognitive development, do not freely respond to God's grace because there may not be any exercise of the will at all. Their possible rejection of the gospel in some feasible world could mean these infants in the actual world are part of the transworld damned, unless they accept the gospel in at least one different feasible world. If that were the case, then the person would not be transworldly damned and consequently part of God's elect. Perhaps then the death of infants in this world is God's way of preventing their rejection of the gospel in other feasible worlds. So maybe they reject the gospel in all feasible worlds, but in this one they don't, simply because there's no opportunity to. Gregory's own language is compatible with transworld damnation. He finds that infants who die prematurely would have lived to commit heinous sin, so in selecting them to die early, God saves them from eternal damnation. So, does that make it fair that others live on to commit heinous actions? Gregory writes, "Wherefore does God in his providence withdraw one from life before his character can be perfected in evil, and leave another to grow in such a monster that it had been better for him if he had never been born?" In answer to this, Gregory posits the skeptical theism response. We may not know what God's reasons are, but we know in some cases there are good reasons why God allows the wicked to live. But, seeing that our reason in this matter has to grope in the dark, clearly no one can complain if its conjecturing leads our mind to a variety of conclusions. One such conclusion is that the infants would have lived some of the most notorious, that's from Gregory, notorious and depraved lives of any humans we know. On the other hand, from transworld damnation, there is the position that there are some people who are contingently lost, that is, persons lost in this actual world, but who would have accepted the gospel had they heard it. Zachary Breitenbach argues that there may only be two types of contingently lost persons: those who would not accept the gospel under any sufficiently non-pressured circumstances, and anyone who willfully rejects God's grace after previously accepting it, that is, apostatizes. Breitenbach admits that his project did not examine the fate of infants in part because Scripture lacks any clear indication that the above-mentioned categories of unevangelized persons are lost at all. However, there are some Christians who would disagree with that position, and, as a matter of historical investigation, the Christian Church has believed that unbaptized infants were hellbound. How could Gregorian Molinism work within Breitenbach's proposed model, thereby increasing the types of contingently lost from 2 categories to 3? If one were to believe that infants are guilty of Adam's sin, a la Augustinian realism or federal headship, and that some of these persons are not elect, then these could be contingently lost persons, if, in some other feasible world, they lived longer and accepted the gospel. Perhaps, however, in other feasible worlds, these same persons would have brought tremendous, notorious evil into the world, and so God has selected them to die in the actual world as infants. Thus, one could logically believe that infants qualify as contingently lost, and that God did have baby Hitler killed, and that we are better off as a result. These seem to be odd circumstances that might be the case, but only God knows what would have happened. In Philosophical Foundations for Christian Worldview, Craig provides possible answers to concerns over the allegedly contingently lost persons. He utilizes Acts 17, 24-28 to demonstrate God's providential workings, which are determined for salvific purposes. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out to him and find him. Infants who die prematurely, however, do no seeking, no reaching, and no finding, at least not in this life. Aha, says the astute observer, but we are talking about those who never hear the gospel and are lost. Indeed, while we know that infants who die prematurely never hear the gospel, how do we know that they are lost? The question here gets pressed over to the realm of theology, specifically the doctrine of original sin. Are infants guilty of Adam's sin? A few options are available, and the Molinist of many hamartiological persuasions should benefit and implement the Gregorian solution to further bolster their own positions. So I'm lending a helping hand here to a variety of perspectives. Another Lord of the Rings reference here, one solution to rule them all. Molinism now has a track record of being incorporated to various theological traditions. It is distinctly separate from alternative solutions to the problem of the unevangelized because it does not necessarily compete against them. It can work in conjunction with them. Yet these categories are not quite the same as we described at the start of this inquiry. Because, for example, the infant in the womb is unable to respond to general revelation, as would be required on inclusivism. Or think of exclusivism, which requires knowledge of the gospel. An infant doesn't have that. Yet, let us explore a few of the possible solutions for infants who die prematurely. Reformed Molinism. First, if one were of the Reformed tradition, Molinism attempts to offer a robust sense of divine sovereignty and goes deeper to explain the interworkings of God's deliberative act, instead of perhaps hastily punting to divine mystery. With regard to the fate of infants, it is held that infants are guilty of Adam's sin. So, all infants who die prematurely are hellbound, right? Well, not so fast. The Westminster Confession of Faith states that elect infants will be saved. Elect infants dying in infancy are regenerated and saved by Christ through the Spirit, who worketh when and where and how he pleaseth. Which infants are elect, we do not know. But more to our project, on what grounds can the Westminster Confession make that assertion? How do the diviners of that confession know that there are any elect infants who die in the womb? If Calvinistic interpretations of Scripture were true, we have greater biblical evidence that infants are guilty from the womb and deserving of eternal damnation. Peels issues a correction contra Craig because Craig's answer seems to be that guilt is that one has freely rejected Christ, but this is not entirely correct. People are guilty and therefore punished for their sins. Thus, God judges based on people's sin. One of the tenets of Calvinism is that humans inherit the sin and consequently the very guilt of Adam, either through the passing of the seed or from a federal headship model, Adam as a representative. All infants are guilty in the womb, as Psalm 51:5 states, "Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me." Gregorian Molinism could provide additional support for the Reformed Molinist. For the Reformed Molinist, perhaps God has decided to create this world because he knew what these infants would do had they lived. Perhaps all infants are hell-bound, and God's decision to have these persons die in infancy is because these persons would have committed such notorious actions in the course of history. So in this regard, Gregorian Molinism is able to provide support to the Westminster Confession's assertion. Let's look at Wesleyan Molinism. Wesleyans deny the inheritance of the very guilt of Adam, and so believe that infants are innocent, and that, in spite of their fallen human nature, they will be gifted salvation. Gregory also believed that the innocent babe has no such plague before its soul's eyes, obscuring its measure of light, and so it continues to exist in that natural light, and does not need the soundness which comes from purgation, because it never admitted the plague into its soul at all. Alistair McGrath writes, Gregory of Nazianzus and Gregory of Nyssa both taught that infants are born without sin, an idea which stands in contrast with Augustine's doctrine of the universal sinfulness of fallen humanity. Is Gregorian Molinism even needed, then? While Gregory himself believed that infants were innocent, he also held that unbaptized infants would be judged based upon what they would have done had they lived. There is not necessarily a contradiction, because one could logically hold of Gregory's position: A, all infants would have committed notorious evils; B, because they died, those evils were prevented; and C, as a result of dying in infancy, they retain their innocence and will be saved. One could also hold of Gregory's position: D, all infants would have accepted the gospel in all feasible worlds; and C, as a result of dying in infancy, they retain their innocence and will be saved. Gregorian Molinism, again, provides additional support, although this time for different multiple perspectives that Wesleyans may posit. Let's consider post-mortem opportunities. There are already some post-mortem solutions for the unevangelized, which incorporate Molinism. If God were to provide post-mortem opportunities for infants, Gregorian Molinism could be the basis upon which God chose those particular individuals who would die in infancy in this world. God knew how those individuals would respond in the post-mortem realm, and so selected them to be part of the segment of humanity that dies in the womb or shortly thereafter. Perhaps then, all infants will be saved not because of any status that they have at their moment of death, but because of how they will respond to the gospel message through some post-mortem experience. So the large upside here to this framework is that it accommodates the view that God will only judge based upon their person's actual responses in the world in which they live. Finally, pluralism. We began this project over the objection that pluralists have on the fate of the unevangelized. Pluralism has been proposed as a solution to the justice of God, the diversity of religious belief, and the fact that the gospel has not yet spread throughout the globe. However, pluralism on its own fails to offer a solution to the fate of infants who die prematurely. What it does is offer an out or a way for people who allegedly worship the divine being through some other religion. But this the infant does not do. So the pluralist must offer an additional proposition pertaining to some attribute of the divine being. Yet at that point, there is nothing distinctive to the pluralist position that the particularist is not able, that the particularist is able to offer. Nothing distinctive to pluralism that the pluralist can't offer. Conclusion. In this paper, I've argued for a revision in the historical retracing of the theological development of God's counterfactual knowledge and how it pertains to divine providence and the fate of unevangelized infants who died prematurely. This ancient proposal by Gregory of Nyssa is compatible with existing Molinist frameworks, specifically those who affirm transworld damnation or that there are persons who are contingently lost. Finally, I demonstrated how Gregorian Molinism could support a variety of solutions to the problem of the unevangelized infants. In many solutions to the problem of the unevangelized, Gregory of Nyssa's proposal that God judges infants based upon what they would have done had they lived serves as a useful aid or a helping hand for Molinists of many theological persuasions. This is a more faithful and uniquely Molinist solution to the fate of infants, and should be integrated by confessing Molinists. There remains a lot more that could be written by Molinists on the fate of infants who die prematurely, and I hope to have sparked interest in sharp-thinking philosophers to pursue this further. Thank you.